Hello, world historians. Welcome to the first podcast of Module 1, The Rise of Civilizations, with me, Dr. Smith. And we're going to be looking at maps today, so I thought we'd start off with this front cover of the New Yorker magazine from 1976. Gosh, that's old. I'm sure some of your parents were alive then. So it might seem a little bit odd to start with a cartoon from the recent past when we're looking at history, world history to 1500. But I actually want to think about maps and the way that they shape the way that we think about the world. And what is a map, after all? It's a way of representing a view of the world, whether, as in this case, you have a New Yorker looking out of his window on 9th Avenue, across the Hudson River, out into the barrens of Jersey and the wilderness of the Midwest. And this is, allegedly humorous. But when we think about maps, the first thing that springs to mind when we think about our world is a view that's shaped by maps, and the idea that maps are tools, that these are ways of looking at things that are instructive, that are objective, that are scientific. We tend to lose sight of the fact that they're also worldviews. And this has always been the case, and it's only relatively recently in world history, really in the last 500 years, that we've started to think of maps as scientific tools. So if you think about the way that someone living through most of world history, the period that we're looking at in this class, would have reacted if you had asked them the question, what does the world look like? We might think of the world from outer space. We might think of satellite images. We might think of a projection of the world in two dimensions. Most people throughout history wouldn't have had a clue what the question even meant. So bear this in mind as we look at our next slide. Again, this looks to us like a reasonable representation of the world. Until you start to think about the history, this was created, this style of projection, and by projection I simply mean the representation of two-dimensionality of what is essentially a three-dimensional object, the surface of the globe. This was created around 500 years ago, again by a European geographer, a guy called Gerardus Mercator, hence the Mercator projection. He created this map for a specific purpose, and he didn't make this because he thought that this was a realistic view of the world. He created this because it was a tool. It was designed to help navigators travel via lines of longitude and latitude from one end of the Atlantic to the other, and eventually from one end of the Pacific to the other. This was designed, again, for its functionality. But because of the functionality, it became, over time, accepted as an objective view of the world. And some of the perspective aspects of this map started to be lost. So bear this in mind as we watch the slide turn to the next image, because this is another projection. This is a 20th century projection named after a geographer called Peters, hence the Peters projection. Now, I just want you to pause for a moment. You can take a breath. You can even pause the video and just think about what has happened to the Earth in this representation, because it's very different than the Mercator projection, which I think is still the view of the world that you see used by organizations such as National Geographic, used in most high school history textbooks. This is very different. So I just want you to take a second to look at the shape of the world, the relationship between the continents, the different land masses, the different expanses of the Earth and the oceans, and think about what is different here. What is the purpose behind this image of the world, this representation, which incidentally is used by organizations such as the United Nations. And while we're thinking about that, we'll move very quickly on to our next image, which is known in the West as the Cognito map, but this was originally created around 1402, a couple of generations before Columbus's famous voyages across the Atlantic. This is where Columbus was trying to get to, ironically. This is East Asia. And on the right of this map, to the east, to the far east, we see a region of the world which is blown out of all proportion, exaggerated, which is actually the Korean Peninsula, which is a little bit larger perhaps than the state of Mississippi, but which in this image dominates the map of East Asia. Now this is a very crude attempt to map out the world in a way that could be used cartographically, scientifically to represent the world. And yet there's still this cultural interpretation going on, which at the crudest level is shown by the exaggeration of the size of Korea. So even if we couldn't read the Korean script at the top of this page, we could perhaps recognize that the size of the Korean Peninsula has some indication of who made this map. But it is still a map that we would recognize as such. Our next map, I think, we would have a hard time identifying as a geographical representation. And this is typical of medieval maps of the world, Mappamundi, as they used to call it, maps of the world, or as it's sometimes known today, a TO map, because you have the shape of the world represented by this outer ring, and the T-shape intersection representing the Mediterranean Sea. And the three continents of the old world, Asia, Europe, Africa, are represented. So it's an illustration, if you like, of the limited geographical knowledge of that time. But it would also be a mistake to think that people were trying to represent the world in a literal sense through this map. This is instructive, this is telling a story, it's making a point that would have been understood by an audience, but it's really a theological point. It's a point about religion as much as it's a point about geography. And the reason for that is because, on a very abstract level, the three continents have been taken to represent the Holy Trinity, but also the center of the world is represented roughly where the medievals thought the kingdom of Jerusalem would be found, the place of Christ's crucifixion, and of course the birthplace of the three great religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So this is a very different kind of map. If we project it onto a modern Mercator projection, you can see there is some correspondence, but you also see that the conventions that we come to assume are objective reality, that north is up, that south is down. These are recent innovations, and these are, like most things that we take for granted, constructed rather arbitrarily. These are products of culture, not products of nature. So I want to finish on a slightly different note with a quotation by a famous American politician from around 10 years ago. And the author of the quote, the context is not important, but I think it's a nice quotation. So I'm going to show another medieval map, and then I'm going to read the quotation. This is the quote. There are known knowns, there are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns, that is to say, there are things that we now know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we do not know we don't know. Now, if you can understand that at first glance, I'd be surprised. But I think these three categories of known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns can be applied not only to these primary sources, these maps of the world, but also to our own knowledge about the world and the way that we understand the world through history, through geography, through exploring other cultures. So just to look at this medieval European world map, I think we can look at this and think about what are the known knowns, what are the real knowledge which is being objectively demonstrated in this map that was created several hundred years ago, and how would that knowledge have been gathered? Second category, known unknowns. So where are the limits of knowledge and where are these recognized? How is this medieval map maker illustrating the unknown? And finally, the unknown unknowns. Where is the mysteries of the world that we would recognize today through our hindsight, our 2020 satellite vision? as being represented incorrectly by this map? What claims about the world are being made, and what are the origins of these inaccuracies, these limitations of historical knowledge, and what are the limits of our own knowledge? So again, trying to think about maps, trying to look at maps. You see a lot of maps in the textbook, but it's always worth remembering that even the most objective of maps contains known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And trying to apply those categories, trying to think about where they lie, I think is the exercise of critical thinking. So I look forward to exploring a little bit more with you in this module, and over the next 6 weeks. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me by email or post your thoughts on the forums page. Thank you very much.